Welcome, everybody, to the Florida Veterans for Common Sense monthly meeting. And as usual, we'll start off with our Pledge of Allegiance led by our good member, Jim Dearman.
Good evening, everyone. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
To the flag,
of the
United States
States of
of
America,
America,
and
to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under
under
God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with liberty
liberty,
and justice.
justice for all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. We appreciate that a whole lot. And as usual, we'll start out with announcements, and I have a very special announcement to make tonight. There's one of our friends who's particularly cherished by our group, and this person happens to have a birthday today, and she also happens to be our den mother, and she's also a former recipient of our Thomas Paine Award. When you talk about political action, this lady takes it very seriously, and at the age of 81 or 82, she walked all the way to Tallahassee, many miles by herself to try to get the legislature to adopt a resolution to control money and politics. And so we certainly want to wish our best friend, Rana Bazzini, a happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Rana. Happy birthday, Rana.
Rana, this is for you.
Happy birthday.
We love you, Rana.
Yes.
I love you, Rana.
You rock, Rana. So the thing that I'm really excited to report about is our volunteer day that we had this Sunday. And Mike and Charles are really to be commended for setting up this volunteer day, and Dave Sigwald helped with our surf project. And this was really important because although we have the trees installed, we needed to install, according to the experts, and make the forest a lot better if we installed understory plants and pollinators. And the Audubon Society loves that because it helps attract insects and birds to the forest. So the forest is really looking beautiful. And Barry Levinson, who is the former president of the Rotary Club that we're working with, took videos of the volunteer day. And so, Rich, could you roll that video? Much, Rich. That's just a good example of the beautiful day that we had Sunday morning at Volunteer Day. And I can say that with that Volunteer Day, the weather was just perfect, and we had enough volunteers. We planted 200 plants, maybe a few more, and we did it. Someone said an hour and a half, but I think it might have been a little longer than that. It was really an enjoyable experience, in part because the weather was just great. And so our speaker, yes, Mike.
Just a correction, it was actually Dave and Charles that set that up. I was not around, and Dave did a great job organizing it. Just wanted to clear that up. Go ahead.
Somebody has, if everybody would go on until you speak, if you would turn off your audio, because we're getting terrible feedback from somebody. So it may be you, Dennis. If you could stop your audio. So the volunteer day really was a good time, and we encourage you to come out. So Charles, could you give us a little report about the volunteer day and the other good work that we're doing?
Well, yeah, thank you. I am excited to say it was a big success. The microforest is really, there's a buzz around town about it. I was just talking to a county employee on another project, our solar power shade that is Kevin Conley's business. And wow, he said, yeah, I've heard all about that project and that's really cool. And I saw your sign go up. And this is a guy that isn't even involved with us. He heard about it because there's such a buzz going on. And now with the sign, people go over and read the sign and it's great. But I need everybody to really become ambassadors for this concept. And I'm going to say a couple things. Number one is the county is actually, and I learned some of this from Kevin Conley, if he's on here, the county is actually taking the shade trees down that are like over parking lots and putting up palm trees because the palm trees are less maintenance. And that's just the opposite direction. Shade trees are long-lived, great habitat, fight urban heating and so forth. So we really need to become advocates of this. And if anybody says, why a microforest? Say, because a microforest has synergistic effects where all the trees grow in an interrelated or synergistic way where the benefit of the system is far greater than just a bunch of trees along a boulevard. Not that we don't need those too. So it's really a signature environmental contribution that Florida Veterans is making. And I want you to talk it up. And my dream is that within 5 years, we'll have a bunch of these around here and we'll take pride and get recognition for each one. So with that, yes, it was a big day and I'd like you all to be a part of shaping our destiny as the Sarasota's urban reforesters.
Well said, Charles. That's very well said. Mike, what would you like to add? And unmute yourself.
Well, our future plans, well, a couple of things. Eddie McKeithen has another load of trees for us free, but we got to pick them up. And I'm just going to tell them to hold them until we got a place for them. But I'm wondering about are we putting any? I mean, is there anybody we're talking to with the city to get another space, or the county to get another space? I feel like we're sort of. I mean, this is a great project. I'm really proud of it, and but like you said, Charles, I'd like to start another one. I'd like to stretch it out. The volunteers are there. I think they'll come.
Let me say this, especially if we have trees in queue. We've got a bunch of eyes and ears, right? The perfect client, the perfect place to put this would be a commercial interest that has some land next to their facility that they have to tend all the time with mowing, and that is just of no real value to them. We need to go to those people and say, we'd like to put the forest in. We'll help raise a little money to match the money that you very much are obligated to contribute. And we're going to let you tell a carbon story and a stormwater story in terms of your company's benefit to the environment. that you'll be very proud of. We'll help you design a sign. We'll put something in the lobby that shows, like Rich Sizzlers help calculate how much carbon you're offsetting over the next 10 years. So, I haven't pushed it with the city too much because I'm not sure exactly what to offer. But if we find a private sector client, somebody with a bunch of land that's just being mowed, that would be the best place to put it. And I think ultimately that's going to be the type of organization that we're going to get the most money from. So,
Gene, you're muted.
Mike or Charles, is there anything else that you want to add to that?
Well, I thought we would be pushing harder on the golf course. At least getting a response.
I can speak to that. Yes, we are pushing on Bobby Jones, but Bobby Jones is going to take a long time. It's a slow project that, and there's a lot of players in it. If anybody knows Christine Johnson of the Nature Conservancy or whatever they're called, the Conservation Foundation, talk us up to them. But that project, the city is about to hire a consultant, and I wish they wouldn't. I wish they would just trust those of us who are here, but they're going to hire somebody. And I really think that's a multi-year project before much happens. Maybe I'm wrong. And Sandy Gilbert of Start and I are supposed to go see city commissioners about that, like in a week to 2 weeks. But again, the problem with the city is that, and other county sites, including Audubon that we've discussed, is that it takes a lot of time. Whereas if we find some decisive, whether it's a Home Depot that with a big vacant lot next to it, or one of those factories up on 301 that also are a great place for rooftop solar, those people will make decisions right away. They'll say, okay, I'll do it. I'll put up $20,000. How much will you guys put up? We'll put up $5,000 or something like that. So really, we've got to spread the word. And Mike, I hear you, and I will keep talking to the city, but I think it'll happen a lot faster if we find a private interest who has a lot of land.
Thanks, guys. So at this point, we'll move ahead with our program, and I'm pleased tonight to introduce Dennis Mitch Maley. And Dennis is a featured columnist and senior editor for the Bradenton Times. And he also hosts the Bradenton Times podcast and Punk Rock Politics on YouTube. He performs stand-up comedy at clubs throughout the Gulf Coast, and he has a very interesting background. He's a graduate of Shippensburg University, where he earned a degree in government while minoring in economics, and he was captain of the school's boxing team. He competed as a heavyweight, and he won 2 national silver medals and 1 bronze while being named an All-American team 3 times. That's very impressive. So we don't want to mess around with Mitch. He was also commissioned as an officer in the United States Army, so he's one of our fellow brethren, and he earned the rank of captain. His field was nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, and he is a graduate of the U.S. Army Airborne School. I don't want to tangle with Mitch, I can tell you that. So Mitch, it's my pleasure to introduce you. And the reason I say that, my dad was a boxer. The best shape I was ever in my life was when I was playing football in high school. And sometimes my dad and I would spar a little bit. He could hit me so hard on the arm that it would go numb. I say, I never want to be a boxer. So Mitch, the floor is yours, my friend. And you're muted. You're muted, Mitch. Mitch, we still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
now
there you
you
go.
got it.
Okay. Yes, I was actually the Army champion as well. So I spent 3 years in the Olympic Training Center, which is adjacent to Fort Carson. And spent some time out there, really enjoyed it, kept me out of the field a lot, and got to travel around and represent the Army that way. So it was a great experience. I was just talking, in fact, the other day on the podcast with Matt Bauer, who some of you guys might know. He ran for county commission in Manatee County, and he's a veteran as well. And our publisher, Joe Clash, is a Marine veteran. And the three of us had talked about how you see less and less service in people's resumes. And one of the ways that shows itself to me a lot is in our obituaries, where 10 years ago, it was very uncommon to find a male obituary that didn't have the flag emblem in our paper, whereas today it's more and more common for it not to happen. And in the conversation with Mr. Bauer, the thing that really struck us was we were talking about like accountability and taking ownership for mistakes, and how some of the members of the county commission with some of these recent scandals had made those statements, and how odd it seemed, because ownership and accountability seems to mean very different things to people who haven't ever served. And it tends to be boiled down to a lot of people as just mouthing the right words, and then, well, I said it, so I guess that's it, and not actually taking the corrective action for the things that you've maybe screwed up. And how the military humbles you and teaches you that we all make mistakes, and that the reason why we drill is because the more you do something, the less mistake prone you are. And when you do make a mistake, though, taking ownership of something means fixing it, or at least the best of your ability, taking action. That's usually harder than doing it right the first time, and that's how you get better at things. And I think that as military service becomes less and less common, I think that's something that we're going to struggle with not having enough members of society that ever had to learn that lesson the hard way. So I'm sure that you guys can appreciate the frustration that causes sometimes when you're covering government. Some of the things is that, first let me ask, is it a local chapter? So is everybody like Sarasota and Manatee County?
Mostly Sarasota and Manatee County. We're kind of scattered around the state, Mitch, but most of our members are in Sarasota and Manatee County.
Okay. So a lot of people might know of some of the scandals we've had recently locally. We've had, of course, Vaccine Gate, which made national news, where we had a county commissioner. And that was another example where we had a county commission chair who, not only restricted what was supposed to be a random lottery throughout the county to just 2 zip codes that happened to be very wealthy zip codes with very little cases of COVID in order to get a much sought after vaccine, but then also put herself on the vaccine list. And like, not even a lottery. She put 5 names, herself included, of people that were just going to jump the line. And it again brought to mind the idea of military service. The officer always eats last. And you don't eat if your troops don't get fed, and you're scarfing it down in the corner sometimes, when you're getting people on the move again. So this idea that you can lead from the back, which is what we see so often, isn't a viable form of leadership. And then when you get people who don't have an understanding of what service really is, that's where I think we go wrong a lot in politics. And, in Manatee County, just like it's probably a microcosm of the country, in that we've moved to this sort of geopolitical spectrum where special interest drives everything. So Citizens United was probably the tipping point on that, when we said, hey, you can donate as much money as you want. It's a free speech issue, and corporations are people. That made special interest job much easier, and it made people like you gentlemen who are engaged citizens trying to do the right thing to participate in democracy and get a positive outcome. It made your job much harder, because now you're going up against a megaphone that is so much louder than the grassroots can ever be, and has so many resources that they're able to control a narrative. And what we're seeing more and more is boiling down a complicated problems. And, we're living in the most challenged times that human beings have ever been on earth. When you look at the number of challenges our society faces right now, our world faces right now, and the magnitude of them, and then you look at how many of them, from clean water, which is a big one that I write about a lot, and Florida is particularly challenged with. When you look at the long-term water modeling for our state's groundwater supplies, they're awful. That's one of the most frightening things you're going to see. In fact, as much as sea level rise is going to present challenges for us in Florida, on the near-term horizon, fresh water is a much bigger problem. And, you know, when you look, there's obviously development is a big issue with it. And Florida, for 50 years now, the top economists have been telling us we need to diversify our economy. We need to get jobs that are the jobs of the future, the clean jobs that are sustainable into the long term. We can't rely on just being a place where people retire and bring their wealth from other places, because that causes a brain drain. When you don't have any kind of industry, then your best and brightest are continuously leaving the state to go and benefit someone else's economy. And then you're looking to service wealth that's brought from outside. And then when your economy is driven almost exclusively by tourism and people relocating and the growth management business that you know grows up around that, that's difficult, because any problem that you attempt to solve by saying we might not be able to do that as freewheeling as we have been becomes a big economic problem. And it's hard to get popular support behind it, because that narrative gets hijacked and people say, well, this is about jobs. It's about the economy. And if we fix that problem that's not on our doorstep yet, somebody's going to be out of work tomorrow. And that's a very difficult political row to hoe. So water is one of those things where, you know, you turn on your faucet and it comes out, so you're not that worried about it. But when you come up to the precipice of disaster, you don't have, when that faucet stops, you don't have the time and resources to fix it. It's one of those things that's on a long horizon. It's kind of like traffic. You know, when people look around Manatee County and Sarasota County and say, why is the traffic so bad? Well, it's because we didn't take care of it 30 years ago. Because mostly people aren't interested in big, expensive projects and spending a lot of time on them when they can't have a press conference every week, when they can't cut a ribbon every week and then show something, you know, physical by the time the next election comes out. So water is the same thing, and development is a big strain on that. You know, when you look across the state from a land use map, you can see, oh, there's a lot of green space. We can afford to build a lot more compared to other places. But Florida is a very, very unique topography in that we're basically this kind of an island, even though we're connected, but we're this giant phosphorus rock. And the tunnels that go under our aquifer are very unique, and we can't just consistently drill water out of it. And right now we're taking water from the water table at about 15 times the rate that rainfall is putting it back in. And we're exacerbating that problem by two things. One of them is the phosphate industry, which is like fracking, very, very, very thirsty, because you're forcing a tremendous amount of groundwater down into the earth to get this phosphate broken up and get it out. And Hillsborough County, for example, in Hillsborough County, the water usage is split almost perfectly 50-50 between phosphate industry, uses half of their water every day, and then all of the residential and commercial and industrial combined uses the other half. So that's an enormous amount of water being sucked out by one industry that doesn't make anything really for us. In fact, most of it goes outside the country. So we're kind of like the Saudi Arabia of phosphate rock, but it's a really, really dirty industry that's using our other primary resource, the groundwater, at a staggering rate, but nobody wants to say no to it. Then the other problem is that every time you build new construction, you're taking, in most cases, permeable land. You're taking that green space where the water can come right down, go into the ground, just like we learned about the water table and water cycle in elementary school, and you're putting it back in, and you're now saying, okay, it can't go in there, and it can't go in here, and it can't go in here, and it can't go in here. And then you're restricting all these places where you then have runoff that a vast percentage of that ends up being discharged into the Gulf of Mexico. So then that's exacerbating problems because it's high nitrogen runoff that is perfect feeder fuel for the naturally occurring algal blooms in the Gulf. So now your tourism industry gets hurt by your residential home industry. So you have this relationship where they don't work. They're hurting each other. So they're two major engines of our economy, and the third one, big legacy phosphate, they're all diametrically opposed to each other. And nobody's having conversations on how we manage a sort of extrication from that. And how do we plan for a future where if we all look and say, well, yeah, we can't keep doing this, obviously. What do we do next? Nobody's having those conversations. Everybody's milking what's ever left of the other gone, and we'll solve that problem like everything else down the road. Well, that's putting a lot on future generations. It's highly irresponsible. I've got a 16-year-old son, he's a senior in high school, and the last thing I want him and his children doing is trying to solve all those problems at once because we want it to, not make any of the sacrifices and not live within our means now. We hear a lot about the debt. Every time spending comes up, that's when we talk about the burden it will give to our children and grandchildren. And it's usually meant as a way to poo-poo what are otherwise good programs. But it's always ironic to me. The debt is, and we can talk a little bit about that because it's one of my areas of great interest in education, but it's eventually comes down to zeros on a computer screen. And if you leave me with a problem about the way that zeros on a computer screen work, I'm a lot more comfortable about our ability to solve that problem than I am something like, well, we don't have enough water to drink. You know what I mean? So it's something, or our oceans are completely polluted. So I'd much rather have the debt problem, but that's the only time we tend to think about future generations. So those are really the special interest landscapes that we deal with in Manatee County and then all throughout Florida. And the unfortunate reality is that we're losing every day. We win maybe 1 out of 20 fights. And a lot of times, you're fighting for half a loaf of bread and you get a few crumbs at the end. And probably the only way that's going to change is if we get more engagement on local and state levels. And I don't see that very much. In fact, I see less and less all the time. And we see that reflected in the media industry in that state news actually in Florida is the least read of any kind. So Tallahassee gets a really free pass in a lot of ways because nobody's really watching them. And even when they have big scandals, they know they could just kind of bite down and wait for them to pass, and they don't really have to pay a price for it. It's been one of the things that one of the reasons why I'm not a big proponent of term limits, and that surprises a lot of people as a good government advocate. And our state government is a good example as to why they don't really solve the problem. And that's that what you create then is just more of a revolving door. And the same special interests still end up pulling the strings and running the show, but you lose the real historical knowledge that goes out the door with your best representatives. So a lot of times the people that stand in there as a bulwark against the worst special interests that happen, they're the ones we end up terming out. And with them go a lot of other empty suits that just go through another revolving door, and they're running for a county commission, or they do their 8 years in the state house and they do their 8 years in the Senate. Then they come back to local government to pump up their state pension because the pay is better at the county commission level. So you don't really solve a problem there. And the other thing that we've noticed with it is that they never really learn their job because it takes about 8 years to really understand how everything the state does works real well, to circle through committees and really get your fingers into the sausage enough to get a good handle on it. So what ends up happening is they're kind of ceremonial, and then you have bureaucrats, staff members. So you'll have a state senator, but then you have $100,000 chief of staff for him who's actually, making the sausage. And then you have lobbyists who's having lunch with him every day. And then you have the lobbyists and the bureaucrats really making the sausage. And then you have the other guy just giving the press conference. And what ends up happening is the person who's really accountable for the end result isn't accountable to voters. You don't even know their names. So, and you don't get to vote them out of office, and they don't have sunshine records, and they can talk to and about anything they want. So we've actually seen that that's not a silver bullet. And really, there is no other silver bullet. And that's probably the bad news I give to people is the only silver bullet is more participation, a more informed democracy, more people paying attention, watchdogging their governments, knowing the names of who's in charge and holding them accountable. That's the only way things get better. There is no, we saw a charter county movement kind of fall apart recently. And some people are like, well, we have to have recalls so we can get some of these people out of here. Well, if you're not getting the right people in, you're not going to get the recalls to get them out. And the charter review boards end up getting hijacked by the same special interests that the electoral process does. And guess what? Less people pay attention to charter review elections, so you don't have an informed vote, being cast anyway. So, that's not really a shortcut. And most of these solutions, what people are trying to find is a replacement for an informed citizenry. And there isn't one. That's at the end of the day, why we've got worse as a country is because we have a more educated population than we did 50, 100 years ago. We have more information at our access than we ever had in human history, than any society's ever had. You can pick up your phone and find out anything you want to know in 5 minutes, but we still have less people paying attention. They're more distracted. My grandfather passed away about 8 years ago, and he read he had an 8th grade education, read 2 newspapers a day, watched the evening news, local followed by national every single night, and he could tell you what was happening at Borough Hall. This guy's a son of a bitch, this guy's no good, that guy I'd want in my foxhole. And that was very typical of his generation and that time. Whereas now, most of the people I know with a master's degree in Manatee County couldn't tell you if they're 40 years old or 50 years old, like he was back then, couldn't even tell you which governments to complain to if you have a problem. We see that all the time where somebody will write a letter to the editor and we have to correct it. Oh, no, you don't understand. That's a school board issue or fire control boards are separate than the county government. They don't even know how the governments work. So, there really is no informed democracy or no substitute for it. I realize every time I'm speaking in a group like this, I'm preaching to the choir because you're engaged, just by being here. But I guess the most important thing we all do is try to inform the people around us. And that's what I've dedicated my life to doing is, left the corporate world after my pro sports career and said, I want to go back to journalism, which I was involved in journalism for public affairs and then for the Pentagon when I was in the military. When I was in college, I had a column in Boxing World, wrote for the student newspaper. But I said, I have a degree in public policy, I have a degree in economics, and I really want to help inform people who want to learn about it. And then what I always tell those people who are paying attention is, when they say, hey, thank you so much for writing about that and help me understand it. Well, thank me by telling a friend. Tell somebody else what you learned, because that's the only way things get better. The only way things get better is if more people become engaged and don't just throw their hands up and say, what are you going to do? They're all crooks. They're not all crooks. There's some good people in government. There are a lot of good people that work in government. There are a lot of good people that work as elected officials and try to do the right thing, but more and more they're outnumbered. And until they have an army of informed, engaged people behind them, they'll continue to be outnumbered, and they won't be able to get that work done. The final subject, and I'll open it up for questions, that I'd like to talk to about today is something that I've been trying to really spend every opportunity I have to speak to groups talking a little bit about, and that's how the national treasury and economics work. And why this has become a real pet issue for me is that as I'm, my son actually says he's graduating high school this year and he's picking colleges right now, and he's going to go be the same thing I am. So he decided, by January that I want to be a journalist, and I want to double major in communications and government, political science, and do the same thing that you do because I recognize the value in it. And as we're having some conversations about, national policy, I realize how incredibly damning the indoctrination we get on how federal finance policies work is, and how few Americans really understand that at all. And a lot of it is owed to an indoctrination that politicians have been using. Really goes back to very honest intentions with FDR. But when we started talking about your money, your tax dollars pay for this, that was a way that FDR tried to tie social benefits, like when he created Social Security, to ownership with people. So he said, hey, if you take it out of their paychecks and say you're paying into it, then they'll never let somebody else take it away from them later. And that was a smart thought. But the problem was that it created a way of thinking that, especially post-Bretton Woods, post-1972, when we went off the gold standard and became a fiat currency, was even more irrelevant. So, and I apologize if it sounds like I'm talking down as I go through this, but to make it real simple, what most people don't get is that since 1972, and it was a great idea to go off the gold standard. That was a completely non-viable system because you had basically two currencies, and you had these two things where gold was just a substitute for value. And they said, well, everybody agrees that gold is worth money and it's worth, it has intrinsic value to it. So we're going to say that the currency's backed by that. And then we're going to tell people they can trade their dollars in, foreign governments mostly, but anyone, but particularly as utility to foreign governments, they can trade that in for a set price of gold. And that they would then have confidence in the currency. The problem with that is that you're using a thing, gold, that has another market. It's used for jewelry, and it's used as a precious metal in a lot of industrial uses. So there's a problem to say the federal government is going to say gold trades for this much at our window. And then to say, oh, but there's another market for gold that trades whatever the market bears. And the problem became Nixon ran into a problem in 71 and 72 where gold was going for so much more on the gold market than we were exchanging it for. It was incentivizing people not to hold dollars. If we had a trade imbalance, people were like rushing to trade in their dollars at the gold window because they could multiply their dollars by then converting it to gold on a different market. So it doesn't work to have that. And the other problem is you can't really have your currency backed by something that you can't predict how much will ever exist. So gold is mined, and some gold's easy to get to, and it costs less. Some gold, for a lot of different reasons, is more expensive to get to. So the cost of getting it isn't the same. And then you can't just say we're going to get this much this year, and you can't just say we're going to get this little next. So it's unpredictable in that sense. And then the other part is it doesn't really have an intrinsic value as represented by that other market. It's this weird thing where gold has no real use that something else can't do better. So it's not a very hard metal. It doesn't last very long. It has this historic, people, value it at something that it's not really worth in any other way, same as diamonds. So it's not really reflective and good that way. But at the end of the day, any fiat system or otherwise has to, unless you go all the way back to the origins of money where people were trading livestock that has the actual utility that you eat it or you use it as a beast of burden or you milk it or whatever, at the end of the day, we're still agreeing that something is worth money. So whether it's a dollar, whether it's a coin, whether it's paper clips, if we all say that there's an established relationship between trading goods and these things, and this many of these things get you this much of that stuff, then it's all kind of bullshit. But if we all believe in the bullshit, then it works, right? So that's where we're at with the dollar since 1972, is it's backed by the full faith of the United States government. And the truth is, and this is what people don't understand with it, is because it's a fiat currency, meaning it's not backed by gold or anything else, we can literally make as much as we want. And now there are real constraints in finance markets on it, but it's important to understand what they are. So the real risk of creating too many dollars is always that you'll create inflation. So if you're creating purchasing power much faster than or outstripping your real ability to create goods, then you'll have too many of these dollars chasing a limited amount of goods, and then people will bid up the price of those goods and you'll have inflation. So that's a real thing that's important to plan for. But what's more interesting about that is that we have real inflationary targets. Inflation is a good thing in economics because it means your economy is growing. Your economy can't grow. So that's why the Ron Paul school and the Austrian economics and the idea of, the greatest tax is inflation. And if you had $1 from 1940, it was still worth the same. That's nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense because you couldn't grow an economy. It'd be like playing a Monopoly game if you constantly expanded the number of people playing. Well, you run out of dollars, and then the game isn't much fun anymore. But Monopoly instructs you when you run out of dollars to start writing new ones because the game can't work without it. So when you think about inflation, understand we haven't hit our inflation targets for like most years out of the last 20. So we have inflationary targets for growth that we haven't hit. So inflation has not been the problem that anybody's worried about, even when we were doing the quantitative easing after the Great Recession, even when we just sent out all this money, in the first and then second, now coming up on the third, different packages that have gone up during COVID. So we haven't seen inflation except in one place where we've seen, actually two places, tremendous asset inflation. So where you will see inflation is the stock market has been setting records since Obama's recovery. And it's just consistently set records. And the reason that's happening is it's asset inflation. So we're riding a continuous bubble because the Fed is pumping more and more money towards these large firms, and they keep buying assets because they have nothing, they're chasing a return on it. And they realize, if we just keep buying each other's stuff and bidding it up, that we'll never kind of lose as long as they inject more in. So you're actually seeing on Wall Street a massive socialist infusion of fiat currency, and you're seeing the inflation. And then you're seeing inflation on luxury asset prices. You know where the largest amount of consumer good inflation has been? Well, number one is in homes over $1 million. So example I'll use, I lived in Greenwich, Connecticut for a year when I first got out of the military back in 2000. And at the time, a friend of mine that was a radio guy there pointed out to me a house when we were driving around. And he said, that house right there has the distinction of being the most expensive home ever sold in the United States. And he said, it's a record sale. It sold a couple of years before, like 97 maybe. And guess how much it sold for? $17 million. And that was considered an ungodly sum for a house to sell for. Well, now the record last I checked was $435 million for the most expensive American estate. I saw the Kushners bought a lot in Florida down on what they call Billionaire's Bunker. And it's a little island down there. And they paid $35 million for a small lot. So think of that in terms of inflation, from 17 million to like approaching 500 million on luxury houses. Look at how many luxury good brands have launched in the last 20 years. Look at new car models and look at how many of them, new lines have started in this $50,000 and up. And then look how many models were created in $50,000 and down. You do have asset inflation, but it's not in the place where the general economy worries about. The greatest asset inflation outside of education and healthcare, those are the problematic ones for everyday people. And they're growing for different reasons, not because there's too much money chasing the goods, but where there's real inflation is in those very, very highest ranks of goods. So now that gets back to why is this important? Well, because we can solve a lot of our problems by creating the money to pay for them. We do it all the time with military spending. We think nothing of, during the peak of Iraq and Afghanistan when they were both going around 2006, we were spending $13 billion a month just printing and shipping it out constantly. There was no talk about inflation. There was nothing, what are we going to do with, what are we going to do? Loaf of bread is going to be $24. Nobody worried about it. And it didn't happen because nobody was out there like Chicken Little telling you it was going to happen. But as soon as we want to make sure that everybody has health care, everybody has access to health care, then we say, you couldn't do that. Where are we going to get the money? We're going to borrow it all from China. Now, that brings up another great trope that people use all the time. We don't borrow any money from China. That's the most absurd thing I've ever seen. The United States has never taken out a loan from China. We've never. One of the reasons why we're in this really, really enviable position is as an economy. One is the size of our U.S. military. It's very, very important. And that's where I differ from a lot of people that are maybe left of center to the left, is that as much as I think we could spend half as much as we do, because I suspect you gentlemen have experienced also that much of our Pentagon budget doesn't come down to the troops. You know, when I was active, we had defense systems that we didn't even train with because it was too expensive. We were still building things from the Vietnam and World War II era, Korean War era even, that we knew we were never going to use again, but it was just in some senator's state or in some congressman's district, so we just kept spending it. So a lot of that doesn't go towards defense, and I think we could have the same level of defense with about half the level of spending, but I do think it's very important that the United States keeps the preeminent military force in the world. And the reason being is that what we've seen when empires have willfully retracted away from being the preeminent force, it creates a vacuum that history has never shown has been filled by kind actors. You know, when you create a power vacuum, the most brutal actors always fill it. We've seen that in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those are perfect examples. China did it, you know, if you go back thousands of years, they willfully retracted about 1,300 years ago, and it was devastating. So when you look at the United States position, you know, I often say, you know, the United States can't really be Denmark, because without the United States being the United States, Denmark can't be Denmark. And we've seen that in the last 4 years when we did have a little bit more of an isolationist approach, and we started retracting our tentacles from a lot of these world organizations where we were, you know, important. China and Russia became much more emboldened by that, and they started moving forward. So that gives you a very good indication of who's going to fill any vacuum that we create, and then who's going to be their client states, because then we also saw that Saudi Arabia cozied up very much to those two states during that time. So that's one part of it. But then the other part is that's what gives us our leverage in a lot of the world economic relationships, the petrodollar being one of them. One of the things that happened right after we went off the gold standard was OPEC decided to make the US dollar the default currency through which the vast majority of oil in the world is bought and sold. That's very fortuitous to us. And that's one of the reasons why our economy is able to deficit spend it the way that it is, because there's a massive demand for US dollars, and there's a great reason for countries that have imbalances not to come running to cash them in, but to instead, you know, use it because they're buying oil with it, and they're settling their own deficits in oil with it. So the petrodollar gives us a big advantage there. And it's the U.S. military is one of the reasons why the petrodollar remains in place. So when you look at our tangled relationships, and, you know, when you look at, if you compare Iraq, or let's say Iran and Afghanistan, actually, let's do it better. Let's do Iran and Saudi Arabia. You'd be hard pressed to say one's the good guy, the good actor, and one's the bad actor. We do try to say that, you know, Saudi Arabia is our friends, our allies, Iran is our enemy, but when you come right down and look at it, they're very much cut from the same cloth. You know, Saudi Arabia leads the world in public beheadings. They sponsor some of the most radical form of Islam, Wahhabism, that leads to much of the radical terrorism that's associated with it. So it's really dubious for us to say, well, they're the good guys, and, you know, Iran's on the axis of evils. It's just that's the devil that we chose to dance with. But, you know, when you look there and you say the petrodollar helps us that way, and the military kind of ensures everybody plays by those rules, because then our ability to go in there with those client states and offer protection is incentive for them to continue to do that. But then the other part of it is, let's go back to the borrowing from China. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from, we made the decision back when, in the 30s when we created Fed, that we would do dollar-denominated debt instruments every time we created money. That's where they say borrowing, all right? But that's very, very misleading, and it's important to understand that. Again, we don't go to China and say, can you give us 1 trillion yuan for the $1 trillion we're going to print? That would be disastrous for us. We were borrowing in a foreign currency like a lot of countries do that aren't economic powerhouses. A lot of them borrow in American dollars. And that is very, very difficult because their currency is pegged to a dollar, and then it ends up really leveraging them in a way that the rhetoric suggests it does to us. But what we're doing when we quote unquote borrow money from China is we're allowing them to take their dollars, their American denominated dollars that they've accumulated, and take them out of the economy and park them almost for free. We pay them a sliver of interest, and it's gotten really since the banking collapse. We've never gone back to a real strong interest rate, and I don't think we ever will, or not in probably our lifetimes. But we're paying almost nothing for that. That's what we learned, is that people are so confident in the dollar as a storage value of wealth. At a few brief instances, they were actually taking a loss on treasury bills to put money into there in foreign countries and saying, I'd rather have 95 US cents than the equivalent of a dollar in another currency or in gold or anything else. Because remember, gold, again, even when people say, well, I'm putting all my money in gold because there's a real estate bubble or something, it's only smart because you're playing on other people's stupidity. Yes, the price of gold goes up in times like that, but only because people get nervous and take their money and move it into gold. So if you put your money in gold early and pull it out when everybody gets nervous, yes, you'll make money. Same thing as Bitcoin. Bitcoin is useless. It has no function as a currency. And it's a dumb idea for two reasons. One, it requires, if you know anything about how it's used, you have to do this quantum computing in order to mine these coins. So they act like it's a precious metal, and you have to build these massive computer server farms where if you look out in Silicon Valley, there's ones football fields upon football fields. It looks like corn in Iowa of these supercomputers to mine the Bitcoins. The energy drain is absurd, and there's no reason for it. You don't actually need energy for a Bitcoin, but they just decided that this is how blockchain currency will work. And then it has a finite number of coins. So you can't have economic policy in any way that would respond to a disaster because you can't change the amount of currency. It's only going up through rampant speculation by people chasing a return. So people are buying it off each other with that asset inflation of too many dollars being pumped into the stock market, and then the buying and selling and buying and selling and buying and selling is creating a false value. Same way as Tesla. If you look at Tesla's stock price and then look at the 800 cars or whatever they sell every year, it's absurd that it's trading for that much. But it's a greater fool theory. And as long as people are continuing to buy it for more than it's worth, then yeah, you can make money off of it. But it doesn't mean it has a real value. You know, everything's value outside of things we need to live, outside of water, outside of real food, the value is what we decide that it is. So when we say that a dollar is in value, people are really looking and saying the stability of the United States and their confidence that our military means that our country is safe. You're not going to have a coup. You know, as close as we saw, you know, the start of one, I think, you know, festering. You're not going to have another country come in and overthrow us. We don't have a military threat in the world. And that confidence is really what leads to the confidence in the dollar. So people don't look for gold. Gold not being on the gold standard didn't hurt world confidence in the dollar at all. In fact, economic policy actually strengthened our ability to be limber with it, which actually increased people's confidence in the dollar after we were off the gold standard. But when you look at creating that debt instrument, here's why we do that. Real simple reason. If we created new money, it increases the money supply. So if too much of that ended up in bank reserves, and that's what would happen if you just printed a bunch in, and the government sometimes is the only people that can play in certain markets that are too big. So if you look at something and say, I want to transform energy, there might not be enough private investment existence to do that. The moon landing was probably the best historic example if we want to use a real one. We would have never went to the moon off private investment. I don't think we would have been there now It took the United States government and a race between two superpowers pouring, their own currency they can create into this in order to make that viable. So when you look at the ability of governments to spend that way, it's a powerful and necessary thing. When you look at the banking crisis, without a bailout, when you look at something like an epidemic with COVID, if the government didn't have the ability to just pump trillions of dollars into the economy, we would have been in an economic collapse. So that limber, part is very important. But if the government decides to direct a whole bunch of new money into the economy, you one, could have a problem with inflation, but then two, bank reserves will start to pile up, and then interest rates will collapse. You won't have a lending system. So how they offset the government spending to support interest rates is they create a debt instrument. What that debt instrument does is it keeps the reserves from piling up by bringing in people's money. So a great way to think about this is a lot of Chinese investors have a lot of US dollars. If you go and you say, hey, we're going to have a bond issue because we're going to spend more dollars. We don't want your dollars out there being spendable right now. We'll give you, less than 1% to park those dollars for 10 years in a 10-year treasury. That's a great deal for us. It's phenomenal. We get to pull all that money out of the economy for 10 years. We're cast with inflation or reserves, and it costs us almost nothing. And what do we pay it in? The same paper we just print up out of thin air. So they're willing for a tiny little bit more of that paper than they already have, just to park it for 10 years. They're willing to just take a little bit more of the paper. That's a phenomenal real deal. And what is China giving us for it? They're giving us real goods through the trade deficit. So they're having their human capital produce things in factories with raw resources and then trading it to us for pieces of paper that we make up. China should be the one saying, hey, I don't know if this is really a good deal for us, not the United States. So when people say, oh, we're in hock to China, it's baloney. And if you look at it, one, Japan has just a tiny little bit less than China anyway, when you look at who owns most of those debt instruments. And then if you consider the European Union one country, which it really is economically, they have more anyway. So it's not really all China. It's relatively small, but it's a symbiotic relationship and helps us have the support the deficit spending and trade balances we have. So we can spend as much as we want it. Now, why do we tax? Because that's how we hedge against inflation as well. We tax money out of the economy. So one thing that's important to distinguish between state and local governments and the federal government is the state and local government really does act like a household income. They have to spend on a budget that they have money coming in. So your state taxes and your local taxes are the actual money they spend. That is not the way the federal government works. Your tax dollars does not pay for somebody's welfare, does not pay to subsidize student loans, does not pay any of it. Your tax, that's all spent by created revenue authorized in spending a year before any of that tax revenue is collected. The taxes don't need to be collected to pay that. The taxes are collected and canceled out of the economy so that you don't have too much money chasing those goods. So taxes are really two things, really, if you go back to the origins of them. Well, the original origin, it created the demand for a federal currency that we needed. So when it was all state currencies and we had a young federal government, it couldn't do international business without a currency. So they created the federal income tax to create a demand for a federal currency. And then now, okay, you can only pay that in these dollars, and anybody wants to work with those dollars. And then after that, it was, how do we stop too much from accumulating too much hands? That was actually part of the problem. Was if we have things like billionaires, they'll accumulate too much political power. If 90% of all of the nation's wealth end up in a few thousand hands, they'll be unstoppable. So that's why the top tax bracket at one time was 90%. And guess what? We had more economic growth during that period of time than we've ever had before or since. So remember that the next time somebody says, oh, if you raise the taxes even a little bit on rich Americans, the whole thing will collapse. There's no historic precedent for it. So that's just a basic, top line, 30,000 feet. look at how the federal government differs from those other governments, and a good reason not to buy into those two myths, which is that we borrow all our money from China and we're going broke, because we can't. Nothing's stopping us from paying for anything that we want to, other than inflation. And I just explained where inflation is actually happening, not where they always warn you from. So at this point, that's everything really I have. I'll be happy to take questions if anybody has any.
Mitch, I have a very important question for you. We're a 501c4. We also have a sister 501c3 to do our projects. But our C4, we try to be engaged civically. What would you recommend for us to be the most effective 501c4 in the area?
Honestly, I think if it's local, I would say environmental issues and good government issues. And there's a real problem, especially in this area, which obviously leans Republican. One of the problems with the modern Republican Party is Ronald Reagan successfully killed the idea that conservation was part of conservatism. Because prior to Reagan, it always was. There never was this push and pull. In fact, the two greatest records of any presidents in American history environmentally are both Republicans. Nixon, who gave you the EPA, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and Teddy Roosevelt, who gave you all the parks and preservation land. It was always thought, and our publisher, Joe McClash, was a 22-year county commissioner, and he was a Republican in that same mold. And he was the only Republican in Manatee County to ever get the Sierra Club endorsement, and only one before or since. And there's no irony in it. When people would ask that, he's like, well, that was the party I grew up with. And it's conservative because it's a resource. And if you have your head around the idea, even if you don't care about wildlife and diversity and any of that stuff, just from an economic perspective, it's always way more expensive to pay for it later than it is now. And if you just let people run over the environment and foul the water and get rid of the groundwater and kill the wetlands that act as a buffer from storms, and barrier islands that act as a buffer from storms, and rechanneling that further complicates that for development, and then getting rid of the mangroves that filter the groundwater on those tables, the cost later is by orders of magnitude greater. So now you're having to take that money, and we're seeing that with cleanups, and you're having to say, oh, okay, now $20 on 20 to 1, not even accounting for inflated dollars. And then you're looking and saying, we're actually paying a fortune for something that could have been relatively inexpensive by doing it later. So environmental issues like protecting the wetlands and protecting water supplies, which is largely just going up against big phosphate, is a huge one. And then I think anytime when you have an issue of good government, so whether a lot of times it's referendum, probably the best thing in Florida is that we have the ability to amend our Constitution. And as we come to this area of gridlock where nobody wants to get anything done, even when it has majoritarian support, when 70, 80% of bipartisan voters are saying, yes, we want this, and they're saying, nope, look at the $15 minimum wage, passed comfortably on it. It phases in, but that was bipartisan in a state that the party that won all the races didn't support that. So we have to look at these majoritarian issues that just run up against special issues or special interests and say, how do we make those better? So those would be the two things I would say.
Thank you very much. Rich, are there other questions?
Yes, we have two more. The first one is from Charles Reith. He says, it seems like the three biggest legislative priorities at the state level, Florida and elsewhere, are: one, canceling local energy/climate initiatives, and I'll add squashing local home rule. And then two, suppressing voters, and three, limiting reproductive rights. Is that a correct analysis? And if so, could it ever get any worse?
Yes. And what I'll say with it is on the third one, that's not an issue that the people pushing it really care about. That's one of those bread and circus issues, I call it, to use a Roman saying. It's red meat to throw to the crowd. It's good to fundraise on. It's good to get people excited about. And you have a lot of special interest groups that have warehouse legislation, they call it, where it's just boilerplate and send it out to states like Pennsylvania, Texas, and Florida, which will pass them first because they have, most of the time they have one party ruling all three branches of their state government, and then they'll get their, inevitable court challenge, and then they'll see whether or not it's going to pass, and then they'll push them out to all the other states. So that's kind of a lab for one of those things. The other two, though, are very much true. One of them is they don't want, and again, this is why the ballot referendums have become so successful, they don't want majoritarian issues. We're into this phase of what I would call corporatism, where we now have this idea of we want to have a facade of democracy. And that's when nationalism and populism are always the most dangerous throughout history. Very, very, very cautious when populism and nationalism, that doesn't bode well ever if you look at the historic examples. And those appeals are always made when they say, listen, we don't want people worrying about how the sausage is made. What we want is people fighting over these stupid social, cultural issues, and we want to take care of everything in the back room, smoky room, so to speak. So getting rid of home rule and squashing anything where things can get done, where you can talk to the guy who needs your vote, is a way to do that. The parties want to run things from 30,000 feet. And that's one of the reasons why getting involved in local government is so satisfying, because you can talk to a county commissioner. You can be sitting at his desk 2-3 times a month. And if you have 30-year buddies who will get out there and wave a sign or flood his inbox with emails, he's going to respond to that. He or she's going to respond to that. And that fear is bona fide. So yes, we need to be very vigilant about fighting back against that. And then two, we need to exercise it. We need to look and say, how do we get our, that old saying, keep government small enough that you can get your hands around its throat. There's some merit to it, So yes, I agree with that. And the answer is to fight like hell to preserve it and not let the state, reduce our ability to self-government, which is really what they want to do.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Bill Maturo, and it says, anything happening with Manatee commissioners on bonding to implement land and water conservation referendum we passed last year?
Yes. So they had their first workshop on identifying projects with it and how that's going to work. But that's a good question, because one of the concerns that Joe McClash had with that referendum was that it doesn't mandate that they collect and spend it. So that's a key part of it, which means if they decide that they just don't want any work, they don't find enough worthy projects with it, then they don't actually have to collect and spend that. It authorizes their ability to. So that's very important to watch. And then it's very important to watch dog in terms of what I was just talking about, which is putting pressure on them, not only to follow through, but to say, this is what we want. That's what's going to drive that conversation, is going to be citizens saying, these are the projects we want, whether it be preservation land centered around wetlands, whether it's East County green spaces, whether it's buying back strategic land from developers. One of the great ways this could be used is there's a lot of projects. There was one that won approval in July, a Carlos Baruf project that was off of over by the airport. And it wasn't in the urban core. He was asking for extra density. He was asking to build in the floodplain. And the reality was he bought a piece of property on the cheap because it wasn't really a viable development project, and it would have sat as green space. And this happens all the time. Developers buy them for pennies on a dollar because you can't do anything with it. If you're a tomato farmer or you inherited it from somebody, you can't get it done, but they can. They look and say, oh man, I know I have 5 friends on that board that'll get that zoning changed on it and give me a density change, give me a comp plan amendment if I need one, and I'll build a project there that doesn't make any sense. And what we need to do is go, now we have this awful land use law here that really restricts our ability not to let people do land use on it. It's called the Burt Harris Act. And Burt Harris Act lawsuits are responsible for some really ham-fisted development. But one of the ways you avoid them is you aggressively take a fund like that and you identify parcels of green space that aren't particularly viable and have been empty for a long time in these kind of developable areas for that reason, and you aggressively purchase them. And then you deed them in a way that they'll be green forever. And you don't even need to make a preserve off of it, even a passive preserve. You say, just let it be green. Don't build a place to park. Don't build bathrooms. Don't build anything else. Just say we're going to own a massive land bank and nothing's going to happen on it other than, you know, whatever wildlife already exists on it. And then the water is going to return to the aquifer through that moist soil that's out there. And there's never going to be macadam over top of it.
Great, thank you. Just for completeness, we did have a question from James Bruin on Bitcoins, but I think you pretty much answered it already, except for maybe is Bitcoin the future? But I think you kind of already.
No, and listen, even when people say a world currency or anything like that, and maybe someday we'll get to one currency, which would be better. It would have a lot of utilities, but then it would come down to who controls its production, everything like that. But the idea that we need an alternate currency is baloney. You know, the only thing Bitcoin is good for is illicit purchases. That's its only utility, is that people buy things off of Silk Road and the dark web with it because it's untraceable to the buyer. That's the only thing it has as an actual utility. Rubini, my favorite economist, he calls it shitcoin. He's this Italian guy, and he says it with this accent, so it's funny when he says it. And he says it on MSNBC all the time. But he goes, I call it shitcoin because it's what shit. It does nothing. And he's spot on with it. It adds no actual utility. And again, there's a finite amount you can create, and then it's done. And it's not sustainable because you're cooking the earth in mining it. So it's a silly idea, but it's not to say you shouldn't invest with it, because again, a lot of silly ideas have gotten people rich because of the greater fool theory, and that people aren't rational in the marketplace, especially right now. Because like I said, the great inflation right now is asset inflation, and there's been no price discovery on Wall Street for a decade because of quantitative easing and all of this money that we've constantly been putting in to ensure that nobody takes losses they should have taken. So it's like this casino where we say, if you're big enough, you never have to actually lose. The house will give you another loan. Well, if you're playing blackjack and loans are infinite, well, then you could be the greatest blackjack player in the world, I guess, right? Because you just keep borrowing and red, and borrow until you hit. And that's what we have in Wall Street right now. So that's where inflation is. That's where welfare is. That's where all the things we're saying we can't do by giving a guy who's working 40 hours in an Amazon warehouse, he shouldn't have the same kind of health care I have at the VA. I was just up at the VA for an MRI at Bay Pines yesterday. Went in there at 5:40 on a Sunday for an MRI. I was out by 6:10. First of all, where else are you going to get an MRI on a Sunday? Where else are you going to get in and out of a parking lot for an MRI in a half an hour, right? I'm an advocate not for Medicare for all. I mean, I would take that over what we have, but I'm an advocate for a VA-style healthcare system. And hey, have all the Cadillac ones too. If you're rich, have the boutique doctors out on the island and all that stuff for you. But let's build a real viable healthcare system like 28 of the other 29 rich countries in the world have, and we could do it with that same kind of fiat currency that we could use to spend that. But why don't we do that? That's the real question I get all the time. Why does it only go to one place? And I'll tell you the honest answer that I've gotten out of 20 years of studying this fiercely. My honest opinion is the fear of creating a society that was more equitable is that it's a threat to the social structure. And the people on top now who benefit most, anybody who benefits from a status quo, it's going to be their nature to say, well, I want to keep that status quo. I'm a little nervous. I don't know, any kind of change. What if it all goes to shit? I've got it real good right now. For the rest of my years, everything's going to be fine. I'm going to die a happy guy, and I know my kid's all right. I'm good with that. That person has no incentive to shake things up. So I think that's why we have the vast majority of all of our efforts for everything is to make sure the 5% of our country always does well.
Well, Mitch, I'd like to thank you very much for the most thought-provoking talk. It's very appreciated. And I'd like you to do us a favor. If you can't join with us, at least sign up on our email list where you can
Definitely.
watch what we're doing and then give us critique, because we've made a commitment to be more active this next year. And we're an awful active group already. And so we really would like you involved with us. And so I encourage you to do that. And we thank you so much. And then to all of our members, we're going to have kind of a planning meeting in 10 days or 2 weeks. So watch your notices for that. And another thing, when we make action requests, please follow up on those. I noticed something the other day, and Mitch will probably confirm what I'm saying. One of the groups, one of the nonprofit groups that really watches the legislature, they said what we need to do to get to this committee and have an impact on that committee is get them 25 little letters. I saw that and I said, 25 letters, that's hardly anything. We could do that with our group in a morning. But we can't do it unless we respond to the notices. So when you see those notices, take action. That's what it says right there. Take action. It usually only takes about 3 or 4 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, and it can make a big difference. If 25 letters will influence a legislative committee, let's flood them with 100. We can do that. And so that's what we're going to try to do this next year. We're going to be more active, and Mitch joined with us. And thanks everybody for attending the meeting tonight. And we'll see you in 10 days or 2 weeks when I set the next planning meeting. Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Mitch. Great talk.
Thanks. My pleasure.